Welcome to the Low Carb MD podcast. No one is beyond help. No one is beyond hope.
As we have always said, we are bringing you medical information and cutting-edge science, but none of this is medical advice. Please seek out input from your own doctor.
Hello and welcome back to the Low Carb MD podcast. Tro, good to see you, man. It's been a little while.
No, yeah, I'm happy to be
Staying
here.
too busy with everything,
This is going to be exciting because, people don't know the two renegades have been working together for the past 6 months. I shouldn't say the two renegades, really like the renegade family and this, social media punk. So I'm excited for this one.
Well, welcome, Doc. Let's hear it,
Yeah.
Tro. You want to do the intro?
Okay, perfect. So
Does he have all the info?
Yeah, we have today Artie Dikeman, Dr. Artie Dikeman. And if you've been living under a rock and you don't know who he is, you should go follow him on social media. The best I can explain his contribution to the field of metabolic health is really around the type 1 space. He's shared the struggles he's had, with his own son, who is type 1, who you may have seen at previous lectures at Low Carb USA, or maybe you've watched his lectures at Low Carb USA. But I think most notably, RD is known for his contribution in the online community Type 1 Grit, which is a absolute must follow for anybody with Type 1 disease. If you or a family member has Type 1, you should go to the Facebook group Type 1 Grit. And basically, the Dikeman family has been huge advocates for people with type 1, for having better glycemic control, having access to unfettered access to education about low carb diets and diets that focus on metabolic health. And he's worked really closely with Dr. Bernstein and getting his message out. Of course, if you've been living under a rock, Dr. Bernstein is the 91-year-old endocrinologist from Westchester, New York, who wrote the book Diabetes Solution and some other books, who basically founded low carb for type 1. Well, I shouldn't say founded, but really sort of pioneered it. So if I have done a shitty job with this introduction, RD, you let me know what I missed.
No, that was a very kind introduction. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Oh, and also I should say he's a social media antagonist like me, and honestly, a renegade is what I said in private. So we're very much sort of like renegades, where the entire industry is out there and we're so far away from what they're saying. We're advocates and renegades. So I when we first met, I said I felt like we're brothers who just never met, besides the fact that we're both bald and rambunctious. And what people don't know, and what they'll soon find out, is we've been working together on a lot of projects, and dealing with the American Academy of Pediatrics, dealing with sort of guidelines for type 1. And I'm just a lot of awesome stuff that I'm excited for people to find out about. And hopefully, what I'd like to know, and I don't even know, is how this all started. So I'd love to just hear about that. How did you start in the space? I certainly know your son's journey was a part of it, an integral part of it. But I'd love to hear, what happened over the last 10 or 15 years.
Yeah.
And that'd be wonderful.
All right, well, let's tell the story. So I think around so the background, the pre-background, I immediately go to the diagnosis portion of the diagnosis event, because that's the traumatic beginning of the story. But to set the stage, and my son was diagnosed in March of 2013 with type 1 at the age of 9. But to set the stage before that, I didn't even know what diabetes was. I didn't know the difference between type 1 or type 2. If you ask me, how do you solve hypoglycemia with insulin or a candy. I didn't understand anything, which is a weird blind spot because, I'm pretty curious about everything. And for some reason, I just had no knowledge about diabetes. And that led to us getting really caught off guard with Dave's diagnosis. But it also led to me being, now that was about 10 years ago. So I'm in my mid early 40s. And that led to me being personally in really poor metabolic shape. So that's I'm 20 years into the pizza, IPA, breakfast cereal, never passed up a donut phase of my life. And so, at Dave's diagnosis, I'm 6'4", but I'm pushing about 250 pounds and in pretty poor shape at that point. But that's kind of normal these days, right? So, I'm a pizza eating, chip eating, beer drinking schlub from the Midwest. That's kind of my metabolic background going into the type 1 diagnosis. And then, I'm married to a wonderful wife, Roxanne, and very loving, caring parents, both of us. Dave is 9 at this point, and my son Hayden's around 6. And Dave was, Dave was always a very good athlete, and he was the island champion. We live in Oahu, quarterback of a flag football team, which is a pretty big sport here in Hawaii. Football is big time in Hawaii. He ended up getting a scholarship, years later, to play football in college, but that's a long story. But the point of the story there is that I was his coach, and there was a spring season where Dave went from this dominant, notable force to making these inexplicable decisions and showing poor athleticism. He looked a little off physically. Roxanne and I, it was our first child, so we thought, oh, he looks a little gawky. He looked rail. He was getting rail thin, and this happened over a period of about a month, and it continued to the point where he was sick, was unable to really do. The teacher called one day and said Dave's putting his head down in class, and we pondered about that. Then he showed flu-like symptoms. And I said, well, let's stay home for the week and recuperate. And the pediatrician agreed. And she said, give Dave a lot of milkshakes. He needs some calories. So, we listened, and my wife and I would buy these giant milkshakes. And during the type 1 diagnosis, the kids are ravenous because their bodies can't process energy. So Dave would drink, thousands of calories of milkshakes, which probably, could have killed him. And finally, he was, one day he's begging me to get him McDonald's. And so I got him McDonald's, and he ate it. He's on the couch. He couldn't move. So I went out and got it. I came back, gave him his McDonald's. He ate it, and then he threw up. And, it was alarming, but the worst part about it was he said, I can't get off the couch. So I picked him up. He had been on the couch, for a couple of days, basically. I picked him up, and I noticed right away, like he was featherweight light, and his body felt bony. I carried him into the bathroom. I helped him get his shirt off. And when I saw his body, and this has just been over a period of a few days, his body had turned into a skeleton. He looked like a Holocaust victim. And I call it, I put him in the shower. I I got him cleaned up, and I called my wife and I said, I think Dave's dying. And so we went to the the doctor. She ordered some tests, and she said continue with the milkshakes. And then the next day she called and she said, you have to take him to the emergency room right away. He's got type 1 diabetes. And so we went into the hospital, and the emergency room, this was a little surreal. We get there and I had to carry him. There was like 300 people in the emergency room coming out the doors. And, we signed in. I thought, oh my God, we're going to be here for 8 hours. This is a disaster. There was nowhere for us to sit. And about 2 minutes after we signed in, the double doors swung open, and someone came out with what do you call it? The cone, the speaker cone, the megaphone, and shouted Dave's name. And my wife and I looked at each other like, holy shit, this is, excuse me, this is serious. And they took Dave right away. And so he was pretty close to dying. He was in severe decay. And it's, long story short, but that was the entry point into the maw of the diabetes industry. And from there, that traumatic story, we were then given the traditional standard treatment of seeing an industry dietitian, taught how to carb count, food pyramid emphasized, and all of that stuff. And now I'm a physicist in real life. And so when we were instructed about the blood sugar control, our physician drew a graph and he said, carbohydrates make the blood sugar go up and insulin makes it go down. And you don't want to go too high or else you'll suffer the complications, and they're quite grave complications. And that was a good tip by him, because that's the truth. But you can't go too low either. And so he basically showed this roller coaster graph. Every time you eat, you go up and then you come back down. And then, of course, it's sort of unrealistic the way he drew it. But I thought to myself, okay, this is a time series. This is a physical representation of blood glucose, and I'm a pretty smart guy, so I feel like I can figure this out, and I bet we'll do well. That was my strategy, or my concept. And so and I'm going to keep going. So what we did was we went home, and I did exactly what a scientist would do. I had Dave for it looked like about 2 weeks just to recover, and while we got used to the insulin and so on. So I would make Dave a bowl of oatmeal every single morning that was, weighed, precise ingredients. And then I was going to determine exactly the right amount of insulin for that bowl of oatmeal. And I was going to test. I didn't have a CGM, but I could finger stick and I could test exactly what was happening, right? So I could hone in over a week. I know I could just nail this and get this line flat. So I would do that. And I was building computer models and stuff. So I would do that. And every day, Dave's blood sugar would go up to 300 or something like that. And then he would come crashing back down, and I would take the data. And I would say, okay, that means I got to give a little more insulin, but a little bit earlier. And then I would give the insulin a little earlier, and the blood sugar would go up to 270, and then it would come down, and then it would go back up again. And I would say, okay, what does that mean? Okay, that means I can give 2 doses of insulin. And so I convinced myself that I could solve this problem. But after a week, and my wife would come home every day from work, and she would look at my result, and she would just not say anything. So after about a week of this, and I was very optimistic, I started to be skeptical because I wasn't seeing I wasn't honing in. There was no gradient descent on the solution of this problem. And what I realized was that this was not a deterministic set of equations that were governing the system. This was a stochastic system, that this high carb food and this rapid acting insulin were generating unpredictability and randomness. They weren't doing what was advertised by the carb counting methods that were discussed in the Pink Panther book that we were given at diagnosis. And meanwhile, while I was doing this mad scientist act, my wife started Googling, and Dave started to complain, why am I eating all this oatmeal anyway? Why can't I just try eggs? And I didn't have a good answer for that. I thought at the time, he needed carbohydrates for energy. He needed insulin to grow, and carbohydrates were the only macronutrient that provoked, so that if we didn't eat any carbohydrates, we'd go back to zero insulin and he would die again, right? So I had a lot of myths in my head, which were driving me towards oatmeal as a main ingredient to survival. And at that same time, my wife started Googling low carb, and she found the Bernstein book, and we got the Bernstein book. And it was like, I went out to the the mailbox one day, and I saw the books here because I was interested, right? And I opened the book, and first of all, the weight of the book, I felt like this is we had read, like, there's a book called Think Like a Pancreas. These are not serious books for a serious condition like type 1, in my opinion. But the Bernstein book felt like this is a real erudite document. And I started reading about his law of small numbers, which is like in the second or third chapter. I immediately opened to that. And damn, that's exactly what I saw in the data that we had collected, was that this was a stochastic random process. And that's what Bernstein discusses in his law of small numbers. And I thought, this is it. This guy has the solution. And so, I tore into that book, man. And we started making changes immediately. And I have all the graphs, the graphs went from, as Dave said, boom, 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 boom. He started making videos right away about his experience to just flat. And we wanted to get on social media. We wanted to tell people, right away, like, something's wrong here. This is the way to do things. And that was the beginning of the whole advocacy. Pause, break. That's the long story.
No, that's amazing. That's amazing. And your work brought Dr. Bernstein's work to the forefront, and it's amazing. I know everyone took a bunch of heat for that type 1 grid. Can you talk a little bit about that, like what the blowback was, or what the medical community
how it got
said
started,
about it?
even.
Well, we immediately, now this is before, really, if it's 2014, this is kind of pre-Facebook group time, but there was a popular forum. Remember forums back in the day? And this was called the Children with Diabetes Forum. And I started to post in that forum, like, hey, this is, does anyone know this stuff? And, it was, to me, it was a surprise that not only was it immediately written off, and that's a surprise because it has obvious mechanistic reality, right? Like, if someone told you that, if I explained to you the law of small numbers and why low carb, why not high, why high carb fails and low carb, I could tell you in like a minute why the physics favors low carbs. It's an obvious fact, but there was a real, to me, very surprising reticence for anyone to accept this information. And then we enter the realm of human psychology with that. But it was a surprise because if you read these people's experiences. And now I know much better. Living with a type 1 child or being a type 1 yourself on a high carb regimen is the definition of slow torture. It's like dying in slow motion. And so I found it peculiar that the idea generated not just a lack of interest, but heat. And we received, for example, people doxed us on these sites, and we would get phone calls from people threatening CPS. Someone figured out what school my son went to and said it would be a shame if someone took him out of his cage and basically alluded to kidnapping him, which was a totally bizarre. I had no idea that was gonna happen, and we huddled together as a family, and I was kind of angry, but I didn't want to continue. My wife didn't want to continue, but Dave was insistent on continuing with social media. But we had the idea then that we better team up with other people who were doing what we were doing. And the problem there was nobody doing what we were doing. Back in 2014, no one knew about Bernstein. There was a few people you could find here and there who were following the book. There were no Bernstein groups or anything like that. And certainly no kids following it. But I did join some Facebook groups when they just started, and I did meet here and there. You would meet one or two people. You'd say something about low carb, and they might message you. And we became friends with three folks. One who's two of who are I guess one is kind of Lada, and the other two had type 1 since they were 2. And then I don't have type 1, but my son does. And so we all decided to start our own group. And, it was sort of a safe place for people with type 1 that were interested in low carb and knew something about the Bernstein method. And, we have a page also. So we didn't want to be secretive about what we were doing. So we had both, but the group is sort of, there was so much visceral heat from people who were not into low carb that we had to find like a constructive space where people could really, share their experiences, figure out how to use insulin in the low carb context. There's a million nuts and bolts to the whole thing. And so that's how the type 1 grit group started. And what's interesting is that the Dexcom CGM became fairly accurate right around then, right when we started the group around 2015 or something like that. And so what you would see is that these people started posting their result. And these lines were just we would have, we don't do this anymore, but we would have like roll calls, and people would post their last 24 hours. And these lines were all flat. And it's not something that you see in other type 1 groups where kids are literally going from 40 to 400 all day, or a good day might be that they only go up to 250 twice or something like that. This was not what we were seeing. We were seeing blood sugars going from 70 to 100 all day long. You might see a 120 here and there, or you might see a 60 or a 58 or something, but then you would see the correction happen. And there were some physicians who were in the group that were type 1 as well. And they were, of course, blown away by what they were seeing and what they were seeing from themselves. And, the story is a long one, but eventually word got out. There were some Harvard professors, David Ludwig and Belinda Linares was Belinda was the big champion. She came in the group and she saw what we were all seeing. And of course, those folks know how to do a real, no kidding, study. And they did. And they, ran a study where they got records from doctors for over 300 people of all ages in the group. And, they did a great job of making sure that everyone in the group had type 1. And they collected all kinds of data on lipids and growth, for the children. And, the study got published in Pediatrics. It was the most emailed article in the New York Times wrote an article about it. It was the most emailed article in the New York Times for the month of July 2018, or some month in 2018. And, it established low carb as not just viable, but an optimal method of controlling blood glucose in type 1 diabetics.
So let's give the listener a little bit of backstory to what you're talking about. Basically, this was a survey conducted, I think it was, a couple of hundred or a little over 100.
300.
Close to, 300 people with type 1 reporting unprecedented glycemic control, which means, the average person with type 1 may have an A1C of 7 point something, maybe 8 point something, right?
Right.
And this group that was found on this type 1, basically on type 1 grid, the average A1C, I think, was like 5.7, if I remember, something like that.
5.67, and the CGM average was 103.
Right. Yeah, which means basically the top 1% in terms of glycemic control, all nestled in this, little community on that you and, Bernstein, it sounds like, and really your son, David, it really were huge pioneers for. And, when this data was aggregated, there was, Eric Westman worked on it, Belinda Linares, David Ludwig, and finally it got put together into this great survey that showed the viability of this. Do you know how many times the American Academy of Pediatrics has cited that study?
I have no idea.
Yeah, it's like one time. Do you know how many times they've cited some like minor LDL issue in 4-to-1 ketogenic diet for epilepsy, which is rarely done anymore? Do you know how many times they've cited that? Like 50 times. 50 times. So how does that make you feel to know that, despite the major stuff that all these things you've accomplished for your own family, the advocacy, that what you've had to fight against, that, really these organizations aren't even paying attention. In fact, there was an AAP article on low carb for pediatrics, which basically ignored low carb. How does that make you feel?
Well, it's extremely frustrating because, the experience of type 1 diabetes is, we're talking about diet for the general population, but the kids, especially in type 1, they're sent down the tubes immediately. Your life is wrecked immediately. And, these kids are told, their parents and the kids are told to emphasize a diet of carbohydrate. And that means 50% of their calories, at least, coming from carbohydrate. There's no way to get 50% carbohydrate into a kid other than to feed them rapid acting carbohydrate. And if you're trying to, on a consistent basis, match rapid acting carbohydrate with these ultra potent rapid acting analog insulins, your blood sugar is going to be unstable. You're going to suffer the complications come on a lot faster than what people are told. So the blood sugars are going to first mathematically guarantee that children experience diabetic complications. They're also going to mathematically guarantee that they're going to be in a state of constant hypoglycemia as well as hyperglycemia. There is no stability. And so that generates, it's a life-wrecking experience. So imagine you're a kid like Dave, you're a fourth grader. You go and have a pizza, like contrast Dave's experience. What is Dave eating in fourth grade once we switch to Bernstein? He might be eating some turkey and cheese roll-ups and a few nuts, something like that. Okay, so it's a protein emphasized diet, and he's going to take a few units of very slow acting intermediate insulin, regular insulin. His blood sugar is going to, and he's got a CGM, he might at worst go up to 110 or 120, or might at worst go down to 70 or 65. If he does go low, he keeps a glucose tab in his pocket, and he takes that glucose tab and he's right back to playing with his friends on the playground after lunch, as all kids do. Oh, we lost Troy.
No, we lost Troy. It's better now. Now we can really talk. No, I'm just kidding.
Okay, so
he probably lost internet.
Let's keep going.
Sorry about that.
What's the high carb kid going to do? They might have 60 or 70 grams of carbohydrate in contrast to Dave's 4 or 5 grams. And for that, they're going to be taking 8 or 9 units of rapid acting insulin, which is different from Dave's maybe 2 or 3 slow acting insulins units. Then they're going to be going out to recess, and their blood sugar might be going straight up. But as they start exercising, that insulin will work twice as fast, and their blood sugar could come crashing down. So every time that a child with type 1 eats lunch at school and then plays at recess, they're taking the risk of suffering from a severe hypoglycemic episode. And now you multiply that by 3 meals a day for a life. And I've seen these kids. We worked with JDRF for a while, trying to do something with some of these mainstream organizations. You see these kids, and their life is wrecked, and the parents think that they're doing the right thing, following the doctor's orders, and they see a kid like Dave, they find out what Dave is doing, and they just the personal narrative has been set by the industry so hard in these type 1 parents that they just can't switch lanes. We see really good adherence with the low carb type 1s. Once the type 1 goes low carb, that's it. These people do not go back, because it's a hell. You think, oh, well, the high carb food is addictive and it's tough to stay on the low carb diet. That's all true. But with the type 1, the reinforcement there, it's like sticking your hand in the electrical socket. Switching people over at the beginning, when the diabetes industry is messaging at every level to feed carbohydrate and use insulin, rapid acting insulins, or else your child will suffer kidney damage from too much protein. They won't be able to grow. Their brains won't be able to function. The myths, the onslaught of the myths from the industry, and there are probably good doctors who believe these myths. And it goes all the way to the stuff that you guys are used to seeing, which is like that LDL will be high from, it's the madness that's foisted on a type 1 family to keep them in a constant state of hyperglycemia by the diabetes industry is just, it's unbelievable. And it's deep too. They reward these advocacy positions to type 1s themselves who absolutely hate low carb, and they push, the diabetes advocates I can think of on Twitter. I can show you, they're type 1s themselves, but their posts are constant pushing of pasta and cake and high blood sugars, and then they hate low carb. And it's no coincidence that these people are rewarded with paid positions by the industry. So
Hopefully,
it is a dark situation out there for people.
can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Can you guys hear me? Okay, sorry. I didn't know if my mic frizzled out for a second.
We're gonna make the editors work hard
Yeah.
today, Tro.
Yeah, but if you look, most recently the ADA was caught in a pay for play scheme with industry. We knew that Big Food has been paying them and sending them donations, but now allegations came out that they literally were taking money to promote sort of processed foods, these certain recipes. So it's clear.
And
to
social
me,
media influencers the same. They were getting paid
Oh.
for their tweets and their messaging.
The Washington Post did that article that Brian's alluding to, showing that these people are getting paid money, right? They're actually being paid to say what it is they're saying. So, this is really important. That's why the SMHP put out a, quick release saying, we side with people, and we, if these allegations against the ADA are true, we think that it's terrible and it represents a huge problem. So I'm not surprised to see you telling me that these people with type 1, their voices are being promoted, likely by industry. Either that or ideology. I can't, like, what does it matter to you if somebody puts almond flour instead of wheat flour in their cookies? Like, what does that matter? What does it matter to you if they use, stevia or monk fruit instead of sugar? Like, how does that affect you negatively in any way? It's like a bizarre thing for a type 1 person to be, passionate about. And it's unfair to people like your son who need access to another way to do things.
Yeah, not only that, Troy, look, Bernstein's book was published in I had to look it up while we were talking, 1997, right? So that's 3 years before I became a doctor. All that time, I never heard of his book until like the last couple of years. Like, how can it be that no one has talked about it? No one has said, hey, let's look if he's crazy or not. And how old is Dr. Bernstein now? You guys may know better than me. I think he's in his 90s, if I remember correctly.
Almost, yeah.
Yeah, in his late 80s, right? Yeah. So, you look at that and go, well, heck, for a type 1 to live that long with good control, you go, he must know something that the rest of us may not know.
Yeah, and the lack of this, like, the situation stinks from every direction. So the lack of interest and even our own doctor who kind of knows what Dave is doing. He asks, you can see him trying to work it out. He'll ask a question. Like, he'll say to Dave, well, before football, you eat a lot of carbs to get your energy level up, right? And Dave will say no. And then you see, like, okay, he won't quite follow up on it because there's a threat to his own narrative, and that is like I said, the situation stinks from every direction. There are so many barriers, right? There's this institutional inertia to continue sending people down the tubes. Everyone's sort of convinced themselves that there's nothing that can be done with this type 1 diabetes situation. And then they quickly write off low carb, there's LDL, or the kids won't grow, or no one can do it. They don't even know what, like Troy said, the almond flour. They don't even know that you can pretty much eat whatever you want on a low carb diet if you just learn a few cooking tricks, like that's like a whole different topic for us. But like raising a type 1, you know, raising a family on low carb, and we are strict low carb in this family. There are no, we don't screw around, but we don't have any kind of, you know, we eat ice cream, but you know, we eat Rebel ice cream, you know. My wife makes waffles, but they're made with almond flour. My wife makes a pizza, which totally scratches the pizza itch. In fact, you don't feel like junk after you eat it, you know. So like,
I'll tell you.
where's the
I know a wife just like that.
Oh, good.
Well,
Yeah.
and the threat is this. If you type 1 scares all of us doctors, right? We're scared of type 1. A lot of doctors won't take a type 1 diabetic. They're like, I'm not doing it unless they have an endocrinologist, and they're on an insulin drip and everything.
I get it.
If you can manage type 1 with low carb and keto, what do? Type 2 is a joke in comparison, right? As far as management. And you go, okay, look, if we can help the type 1s not have to shoot insulin all day, and we know insulin's a bad thing in excess. So the problem is this fantasy, and Jason Fung was one of the first ones I heard talking about it, was we have this fantasy that you could eat all the sugar you want and the insulin just makes it disappear into space somewhere and it doesn't have any effect on the body. It's like, well, it's jamming it into your tissues, right? And all these diabetes complications that we see.
That's right. That's I say, even if you eat that cupcake and your blood sugar is flat as a type 1, I mean, there's 3 things that can happen. And none of them are good. The first is that you go low. The second is that you go high. And really there's 4. The third is that you go high and low, or lower than high. But the fourth is you somehow got lucky. And what have you done with that? Where did that cupcake go? And that means, and this is the kind of thinking now, because what's happened in the last 10, even in the last 10 years, when we're new on the scene, there are newer insulins, there are CGMs, there are pumps. And so you have these kids, and kids are not stupid, and they're in 5th grade or 6th grade, and they've got their pump and they've got their CGM, and they're looking at that CGM all the time. You know, it's like driving, you're talking to somebody, you know, and you listen to the radio, but you have to always kind of keep your eye on the road. So that's what the CGM's doing. But these kids are smart, and they say, okay, I'm starting to go up. I'm going to jam a few units of insulin in. And what you can do is, and there's a name for this called sugar surging that's promoted by people in the diabetes community. And what's happening with all the advent of technology is not necessarily that the blood sugars control is better, because you're still stuck in this random universe, right? You're still stuck with this stochastic solution. But what's happening is that the type 1s are starting to develop type 2, and they're developing type 2 in adolescence. So you've got what's now called double diabetes. What we see with the type 1 kids is that the type 1 kids, the occurrence of obesity in type 1 kids is now higher than it is in the quote unquote non-diabetic child population. So imagine that you're a type 1. We know the physiology of hyperglycemia and what it does in the micro and macrovascular context. Now, on top of that, you're pouring more gasoline on inflammation from obesity and insulin resistance. And that's the situation that we're in. So the doctors, we should be sympathetic. The doctors can't even tell if the kid's coming in with a blood sugar of 400, if the kid's type 1 or type 2. How can you tell? You could try to run some antibody tests, but not all the antibody tests for type 1 are known. So this is the situation we're in.
I think one of the things that's terrible is that ultimately it's the kids who suffer. The higher the glycemia, the more likely to have nerve damage, heart damage, more likely to have poor mental health, the more, and you're absolutely right. This non-recognition of the double diabetes, insulin resistance as an issue, I think doctors, it's funny, you really get a sense of the problem in medicine when you listen to Bernstein talk about what they said to him when he even checked his blood glucose once or twice a day. Like in Diabetes Solution, he talked about the fact that they like literally harassed him about it. They wouldn't,
Yeah.
he had to get it covered just to finger stick, to get finger sticks covered, right? Because they didn't want to cover it. Insurance companies don't want to cover it. And now they didn't want to cover CGMs. Now it's covered in type 1, you know. So I think there's this problem. And the problem is when it comes to food, doctors are like, well, people can't do it. It's too hard, you know, it's too restrictive. And you set up the patient to fail. Instead of saying, well, what do you need? What can I help you? How can I help you get a more stable blood sugar, right? So this access to type 1, this access to low carb information, it's really about patient empowerment. You know, it's like, how can we help you against the thing that is harming you, right? In a world that has that thing everywhere. Right?
It's just so frustrating. The whole thing is so frustrating when the diabetes educators are telling our patients to eat carbs 6 times a day, eat all day long carbs so that you have stable blood sugars.
Yeah.
And when you look at it with someone like RD comes out and goes, wait a minute, the sugars are all over the place. You can't manage this. This is unmanageable because you're having all these roller coasters up and down and all over the place. If you even it out, and these guys think, you know, it's dangerous. And so that's why, I mean, the biggest concern all doctors, I think, have with, and I would love to hear your take on this, is the, you know, hypoglycemia. And if you're in ketosis, do you manage your hypoglycemia better symptomized as you would if you're not?
That's a good question. So, you know, the first thing is, if I ask, let me put it this way. So I've talked to, because of the type 1 grit, and I'm an admin, so naturally I'm going to speak to, after 10 years, thousands and thousands of people with type 1 diabetes, right? It's just a daily thing. I wake up, I have my coffee, and I check my messages, and there are people who have seen Dave's videos or whatever, right? You can imagine, right? And it's like this for, you know, that community grew. So now it's like that for lots of us, right? And I've never heard of anyone who's had an endocrinologist who understands how to control type 1 diabetes in the low carb context, meaning how do you use insulin? So let's take a typical dinner that Dave would eat, which would be, let's say, steak and eggs, or if we can throw some broccoli we can pretend that there's some value in the broccoli. And so, you know, how does he bolus for that? Well, if you read the standard carb counting books, it would seem as if there's no insulin required for that meal. And so if you ask, you know, 99 out of, well, maybe 100 out of 100 endocrinologists, they wouldn't know the answer to that question. That they might know that it, you know, there's now rumors that protein may or may not require insulin, but that information is all, as you said, been available since 1997 in the Bernstein book. So, you know, the industry, this goes to show you how remarkable the industry has controlled the message, because from top to bottom, you won't see people like Dave. Like, wouldn't it be amazing? And we've put in papers for the ADA scientific sessions. Wouldn't it be amazing to have somebody like Dave, who's like, here's a kid who's had A1Cs of 5.0% or less for 10 years. There's no record of a kid who has had diabetes with the blood sugar control Dave has. So why wouldn't Dave be able to present some discussion? And of course, we were rejected by the ADA to do that. You know, and this example occurs in type 2. What about their former CEO who reversed her type 2 diabetes using a low carb diet? What happened to her?
He's the former now.
She's the former,
right? She started talking about it. And then you have a conflict of interest. You see here on both sides. You go, oh, what do we do? Right?
We interacted with her. We know what she's up to. I said, well, I have friends that sat next to her at a meeting, and she didn't eat the rice. And someone said, why aren't you eating the rice? And she said, I don't eat carbs. And they said, this is cauliflower rice. She said, oh, okay. I didn't know that. So she ate the rice. So, you know, and then what happened to her, right? So they lauded her as the first diabetic. Oh, we have a real diabetic now involved with the ADA. And then we saw like the first thing that she did was go over to Bernstein's office. She's posting pictures of her and Bernstein, hanging out. And I called Bernstein. I said, what the hell is going on over there? And so
and they got rid of her real quick. And now the allegations are coming out about what the ADA is doing. I consider the ADA a terrorist organization along with the AHA. They take food money, they take food industry funding, and they give people harm with no remorse.
I see their chief scientist is on social media. The funny thing is nobody follows them on social media. The only comments on social media are negative.
Oh, and so I love it.
It's
Dr.
clearly just a joke.
And you troll them, and I love it completely. I love it.
And their chief scientist, he seems to be more concerned with driving people's LDL to zero and promoting, statin manufacturer induced guidelines than he is about getting people's A1Cs under control or teaching them proper dietary measures to lower their weights and get rid of their insulin resistance. You just cannot get the establishment to give this topic any breath at all. And it's always been like that. And so I'm a very loud, like you said, Troy, I'm a very loud diabetes advocate. But there are counterparts, parent type 1 advocates, but they are industry. So they have podcasts, but you will see that their podcasts have sponsors, right? So it's been a while since we all kind of started at the same time. So you can look and see, how are the kids doing? And this is not a victory lap. It's sad. Of course, I care about people or I wouldn't be doing this. So it's not like something I'm happy to say, but the kids are doing terrible. They're all obese. Their blood sugars are high. The parents don't look good either. I told you I was 50 pounds overweight. I lost that weight a long time ago, right away. But they keep going on taking the industry money and promoting these bad ideas. And they're so full of hate for people who are doing better than they are. Well, now we're kind of meandering around, but you're getting a kind of a picture of how awful the diabetes industry is and how you really have to be a self-advocate. You have to go find the information, and then you have to find, at the minimum, a physician who won't impede you. Or else your kid, if you have a strong armed physician, they will insist, they will fire you, they will threaten you. This is another huge problem. And that's why I said the situation stinks from top to bottom. So navigating this scene is for a person without agency. And people, this is a complicated situation to deal with. I'm a PhD. My wife is a PhD. So we're very strong people. And we were able to break this, but it is not easy. And for an average person, it's just a hopeless situation. And you asked me how I felt. And now once my engines start revving, it's incredibly frustrating. It's angering.
Yeah, I think we all share that frustration, because all the time you hear the government talking about, we got to cut the cost of insulin, but we can't do that. But we can manufacture a new product that we can deliver all over the world very quickly in months. But you can't make insulin more, efficiently or cheaper for people, or educate people on how to come off of insulin. It's like, this is Tro knows, when we were trained, type 2 diabetes is a chronic progressive disease. There's no cure, right? It's a chronic progressive disease. And we have a lot of patients who would argue that, and we would argue that. And so I think it's such a hard thing when it's everyone's against common sense and say, well, okay. I remember having these discussions with doctors, and they worry about hypoglycemia, so we'll stop the insulin, see what happens. Right? I mean, you go back, like when you were telling your story initially, the management of, and this is why it's the other thing is censorship is so I'm so against that, because initially the way they treated diabetes, mostly they had type 1 diabetes back then because they didn't have the obesity issue. all they could do is check the urine for sugar. So they checked all this sugar and they go, oh, there's all kinds of sugar. These people are dying because they're losing all their sugar. Let's give them more sugar. So they had 100% mortality rate on a high carb diet. So then what do? Osler, I have the book sitting here. He says, let's cut the carbohydrates out of their diet until they stop peeing out sugar and see what happens. Then all these people start living, the type 2s at least, right? And the type 1s lived longer on a very, very low carb diet. But, then insulin came around and everyone said, oh, forget all that old stuff, right? That's old school stuff. We don't do that anymore. We just shoot the drug. And now we have drugs to make you pee out the extra sugar, right? Or we have all these things that you say, well, why not just put the extra sugar in the system and see what happens? It's so maddening. And it's amazing that there's such a blinder to this.
Mm-hmm. It is. Yeah. And on top of all that, you have the normal problems with that the patients are enabled. You can't get enough carbohydrate into the kid unless you're giving them ultra processed food. The kid, you cannot stuff a kid with the diet of 50% sweet potatoes and apples. It's not going to happen. You have to give them chips and pancakes and crackers and jellies and all that stuff that we know will warp and derange. And this is again, I can go on. The big pushback on the damn low carb diet from people who are not in such good shapes themselves is that you'll get an eating disorder. And now we know that the eating disorder, it doesn't come from the low carb. It comes from the ultra processed junk food. And that's precisely what that has to be central to your strategy. If you're following the orders of the diabetes industry to eat such a high carb diet, you just can't do it. And if you try to go low carb, you're going to be threatened with this insane idea that eating a healthy diet and running normal blood sugars is going to cause you a disorder.
What's crazy is on this podcast, we had Andrew Kutnick on, type 1 diabetes and a researcher, right? And he's doing research on himself because he can research on himself. And he told us here on the podcast that if he works out like high intensity interval training, he has to shoot twice as much insulin. He gets hyperglycemia, symptomatic hyperglycemia, high sugars with exercise. And they're telling us to carb load that. Well, you want to carb load hyperglycemia? It doesn't make sense, right? So if he waits to shoot the insulin, he has to shoot twice as much insulin to get his sugars back under control. Yeah. Because in our mindset, we think we're going to be burning off all the sugar and you're going to get low sugar and you're going to die.
That's right. Yeah. And I know all that from having, even if you're low carb, and of course, Dave still has to take insulin in the low carb context. He still has to take his bolus insulin. He can't eat a meal without taking insulin or his blood sugar will go high. And so he does everything right. Athletics is like the final frontier, though. That is a problem that is just really difficult. But there are strategies available to you. But if you're eating high carb and trying to do sports, it's a hopeless situation. There's just too much variability going on. But if you're a low carber like Dave, you have a chance. You're never going to keep your blood sugar at 83 during a high school basketball game, but you can keep it below 150, and you can prevent yourself from having a hypoglycemia that requires you to tap out during the game. Absolutely. So even in that case, low carb is favored. There's no benefit to the diet that they're telling people to follow.
I think, we're talking about the intersection between industry and medical organizations. We're talking about medical dogma. We're talking about huge blind spots in type 2 diabetes, type 1 diabetes, athletics. The nutritional recommendations are huge, very, and the dogma and the sort of authoritarian approach of promoting carbs is truly a harm on this population. And I'm happy, RD, that you and myself and so many others and Brian, we're starting to bring this out, the needs of people with type 1 out more and more. I think I'm late to the show here. A lot of you guys have been doing a lot more work than I can, but this is why I'm so excited about the conference at Boca, that's coming up, where we're focusing on type 1, the SMHP conference, which is going to have a workshop for type 1, an entire day devoted to type 1 diabetes, which I think is, something I'm really looking forward to. And something that the listeners can look forward to is that, before we started, we talked a little bit about this, but, sort of our teams have worked together to challenge the AAP and their, low carb guidelines. And we're coming up with some consensus statements for type 1, which I think will be really helpful. So if you're a listener, stay tuned for those things, because, those are coming out pretty soon. And that conference in Boca, where I think you're going to be there, right, RD? You're going to be there. I know David's going to be there, or you're going to be there, or we're not sure yet.
We're not sure. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll figure out a way to get you there. But the idea is going to be we really have to bring awareness to this, and that whole conference in January is going to be devoted to type 1, probably sorely needed. And I'm sure, somebody like Dr. Bernstein will be happy to see that, after fighting for this many years, and you and your son after fighting for this many years. So anyway, thank you for coming on. Brian, did we cover everything we needed to?
I wanted to thank you. I think, I can refer patients to what you're doing, and it's so helpful. So, having a parents with type 1 diabetics is such a hopeless situation. So someone like you, I appreciate, because you could have just stepped down, and when you get the pressure and the heat and, threats to have your kids taken from you and everything, to not just shut up and say, okay, I'll just be quiet and just do it with my family and not help other people. But the fact that you have this passion, that you're reaching out, that you take the risk, I really appreciate that. I mean, that people like you are the ones who change the world, and the medical establishment may never get it. It may never get it, but there's going to be doctors and there's going to be people out there who
we're going to
understand
it. Brian, I'm sorry. We're going to make them get it. Okay.
Well, we'll make them get it, but you know what I mean? It's like certain things you look and there's so much conflict of interest, and, we got to clean up our system for sure. I mean, doctors right now are at an all-time low of respect and, trust. And we violated that as our medical community. So when all these things are coming out about conflict of interest and all these studies are garbage, it's really, really devastating, because what science do you follow at some point? Like we have to depend on that. That's why having people like Ben Bickman, who I just talked to this morning, and, people of great integrity, they're doing the right thing, and they'll fight the system. So that's what I mean. People like your family coming out and saying, hey, we're not going to just lay down and not talk about what's happening when we have type 1s with A1Cs in the 5 range. I mean, better than the average person.
Or
huh?
you can get down.
Yeah, I know. But I'm talking about your average that you're seeing in this 5.6, 5.7. That for a type 1, that's unbelievable. I mean, I've seen type 1s that are running 10, and the endocrinologist is happy about that.
Right.
It's insane.
Yeah, there's a lot of the type 1 grid people who were 5.6. That's too high. But anyway.
Yeah, it's amazing.
It's
amazing.
Story.
But the impact you're going to have on these kids' lives going forward, it's just dramatic.
Yeah, and now we see it because we've been doing it for so long. And what Dave is, it's a good closing note, because I think what Dave's contribution really has been, it's easy to get on social media and stuff, but he's actually been doing the work, and
we should talk about him for a little bit, because he's presented posters, he's done lectures, he went out to Harvard, he went out to
he was with just Eric on Westman, Sean Baker,
right? I mean, this kid is a star, a rising star.
He was just on Sean Baker, and he was awesome, right?
Yeah, so we got to get him on here too, Brian.
We have to drag him on. I'll drag him onto my other.
I thought he was coming today,
to my other podcast.
I thought he was coming today. Hey, you can't get him before us, Brian. Okay.
We'll work out a deal, man.
Yeah, we'll do something. Listen, RD, this is awesome. Thank you so much for coming. How do people find you, support you, find your work, find your son, find his work? How do they get started right now?
There's a lot of breadcrumb trails we're trying to leave. So Diabetes University on YouTube, that's the Bernstein channel. And there's over 150 videos that my kids have produced that cover every single topic you could imagine. Then there's the Type 1 Grit page on Facebook. I'm on Twitter, RD Dikeman on Twitter. So if you Google low carb type 1 diabetes, you're going to get residue from Type 1 Grit, me, everybody who's been in Type 1 Grit. There's so many different brands now branching out. Type 1 Grit was the original, but now there's lots of variations of that, that was the whole goal all along, was to spread.
Quick question before we part ways, and we'll put all this in the show notes. How do you feel about the newer closed loop pumps that have tighter targets, that are targeting 100 milligrams per deciliter target, right? How do you feel about them?
I have a good story about this. So if you give me a couple of minutes, I'll give you an answer.
All right, maybe we do this on the air, Brian,
no, let's do it. Let's do it.
Let's do it.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So originally, my second son started doing the Bernstein productions, and he needed a class project. So he actually developed, he's a real math physics guy, and he developed, using computer code and mathematical models, to prove Bernstein's law of small numbers. And he showed Dr. Westman. Westman got him a gig at the SMHP. This is during COVID, right? So he gave a talk, it's on YouTube, about what are the physics of low carb and type 1, and why does it work, right? This is not a well understood topic. And so he exposed the underlying dynamics of how injected insulin works and why it favors normal glycemia. And most people might think that low carb, there's some nutritional argument, because there is a nutritional argument in type 2 diabetes, but really the reason low carb works in type 1 is because of how injected insulin works. And that's the Bernstein law of small numbers, which is kind of a vague statement, which is never, there's no mathematical scrutiny until he did that analysis. Now we know precisely why it works. And so Belinda Lanier saw that, and she asked Hayden if he could extend his work to loops. And what we know in low carb in type 1 grid is that people following a very low carb diet using loops have these beautiful flat lines. And so he did put in controllers into his simulations, and he has a high carb and a low carb and a model with the isocaloric, yada, yada, yada. The profiles are taken from the literature. And Andrew helped him with this, Andrew Kutnick. We talked about him earlier. And he gets the exact quantitative result that you see in open literature for the high carb case, which is that the averages are around 150 or something like that, with very high standard deviations, meaning the blood sugar is all over the place.
Roller coasters.
And with the low carb, he gets exactly what we see in our informal polls in type 1 grit, which is that the average blood sugars are about 90 and the standard deviations are low. And it's a perfect fit. So that is a tool that favors use by low carbers, but the kinetics of injected insulin, whether you use them through a loop or not, you cannot achieve normal glycemia on a high carb diet. It's not if we only could invent a smarter algorithm. That's not the reason why you can't achieve normal glycemia with a high carb diet. And I think that was the naive expectation of the closed loop developers, that if we just had an algorithm replace the human being, we could get flat lines and everyone could eat all the cake they wanted and everything would be fine. That's not the case.
How do you feel about the closed loop with aggressive targets for people who are low carb?
I would absolutely, if Dave wanted to use one, we would hook him right up. But his perspective is, look, I take a dose of Tresiba every morning, and I go about my day. I I'll take a pre-filled syringe of regular Humulin R intermediate acting insulin for my lunch. And it's easy for me just to roll my sleeve up. It's a 2-second operation. If my blood sugar goes high, I have another preloaded syringe with a unit of rapid acting insulin. I hit that in the deltoid or my thigh. And for that inconvenience, I don't have to wear a pump and fiddle with my loop. And sometimes the pump can cause scarring, so you're not getting even. So there's pluses and minuses on both cases. So Dave's, and that's good. People should have a choice. So I have friends that absolutely adore the loop because they're able to use less of their cognitive functioning dedicated to diabetes. So it's a personal choice issue, but it's the low carb is the big thing.
Well, what I was happy to see was that, because I would struggle historically with my type 1 patients because the glycemic targets were so high, right? They were shooting for like 130, 150. And now the newer Medtronic closed loop system, you can go down to 126, 110, and not even 100. So you can get even tighter control, which I think benefits the low carb community, because previously somebody with low carb could easily do better than the pump, right? The
problem is a big one. And the only reason that the low carbers are using the loops is because they're using the hacked loops, the homemade stuff. Most people are, and then there's a couple of cases with the commercial systems that people have learned how to trick them into running quote unquote low into the 80s and 90s. But that's a problem. And the reason in the work that Hayden did with Belinda exposes that, because we can take the modeled simulated system and try to run a high carber at a normal glycemia level of 90. And what happens is that the hypoglycemia is severe and devastating in those cases. And
I'm talking about the low carb people.
The low carb people don't have that, because
that's what I'm saying. And now the pumps go down to a level of at least you're able to target a lower glycemic target.
Yes.
I don't have exposure to high carb people, so there's the benefit of that.
I think if you're a high carber and you're trying to run an automated system at a blood sugar of 90 or 100, you're going to kill yourself.
Correct. Well, that was too long of a question. See, Brian, you shouldn't have let us go.
That's a fun topic, though.
It's all good information. Thank you so much.
Listen, RD, thank you again. And people, you can find them on Twitter, Facebook group. I tell all my type 1 patients, type 1 grid. You can find them on YouTube at Diabetes University, and Adapt's got a lecture with him, I think, coming up. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Hey guys, thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us.